All right, so this gallery actually has two ideas, but they're absolutely integrated together. One is forces of nature, and most of the pictures, there are two pictures on the other side of this wall that really speak to that idea. It speaks to the early part of the 20th century, in the first 2 decades. Artists Rockwell Kent, Paul Daugherty, also one could include this little Marsden Hartley. But the other part of the gallery that we're looking at right now that has Georgia O'Keeffe over here and Arthur Dove over on those walls, John Marin here, Marsden Hartley in the center, and Harold Weston over on the far end. This is an idea that can be encapsulated in what I call nature and abstraction. And it's about this idea that this transitioning part of America in the early part of the 20th century, you know, cities were becoming more dominant, but this connection to the land was to the soil is what the artists in the Stieglitz circles, O'Keeffe, Dove, Marin would talk about, defined what it was to be in America. And Arthur Dove and Georgia O'Keeffe in particular were part of this circle that was around the gallerist photographer Alfred Stieglitz. And at the end of World War I, they were all looking for a new stylistic vocabulary to speak to that American experience of American landscape. And how can you define it without relying on these stylistic elements that have been coming from Europe? And so Georgia O'Keeffe and Arthur Dove really reinvented that stylistic language. And they were both looking for what they called visual equivalents to the experience of the American landscape. And for both of these artists, it was very important that they actually live and experience where they were, to understand where they lived, and to go and try to incorporate that emotionally into the way they thought about their work. And so you have Georgia O'Keeffe, and both of these artists, I would just say, both Dove and O'Keeffe, the Phillips Collection is the very first museum to purchase their work. Duncan Phillips discovered their work in New York at Stieglitz's gallery in 1926. He responded immediately to what he was seeing in their work. He bought 2 paintings by each of these artists, and then over the next 30 years, 20 years, I guess, you know, he bought a total of 6 paintings by O'Keeffe for the Phillips collection. But he had this incredibly close relationship with Arthur Dove's work. He never met Dove, but he became Dove's patron in 1930, giving Dove a monthly stipend that allowed Dove to stop doing all commercial illustration work and focus entirely on his painting. And for that support, which Duncan Phillips continued until Dove's death in 1946, Phillips had the opportunity every year to go and have first choice from Dove's yearly exhibitions. And so by the time Dove died in 1946, Duncan Phillips had acquired 48 works by Arthur Dove. Both, you know, oil paintings, watercolors, which Dove did not begin doing until the 1930s, and one assemblage. And so we have this incredible collection. We have more works by Dove today, but you know, Duncan Phillips was absolutely convinced that Arthur Dove was one of the most important American painters, and so original. And I think if you look at these 3 pictures, this is a later work from the 1940s that you see over here, the locust, rows of locust stone. But if you just look at these 2 pictures from the early 30s, this is red sun, this is sun drawing water. You get a sense of Arthur Dove is such a sophisticated, well-read, thoughtful person. He had been in Europe in the early part of the 20th century, and then he came back to America. And he lived on a sailboat for a number of years in the 20s. And then in 1933, he moved to Geneva, New York, upstate New York, where his family had property, and he spent a number of years there. And so he was like immersing himself in nature, understanding what was happening every day with the weather, trying to understand how do you depict things that you know are happening scientifically, like the evaporation of water, but you can't see it. Or, electricity going through the air. You can't see it, but you know scientifically there are ways it can be measured that we know it's there. And so Dove was fascinated by this idea, how to find the stylistic means to show these ideas in a two-dimensional format. And so his paintings are always about trying to find, the visual equivalent to express these ideas about the landscape. And so here, this is about being along the shore, about the evaporation of water into the air, the power of the sun in this picture, and this is about the power of the setting sun, and the idea that there's almost like this movement in the earth as the sun descends like a curtain coming down on the end of the day. And he is using line, color, and form to create these incredible pictures that, talk to us about the experience of the landscape itself. Georgia O'Keeffe, she's so admired her colleague she did something a little different, but she was totally on that same page with him. She always said there's nothing real in realism. It's really all about simplification, synthesis, emphasis, selection. These are the things that the artist, chooses and emphasizes. And for O'Keeffe, just as for Dove, living in a place over time was something that was required in order to understand place. And so you see in this picture of Rancho's Church here on the left, this was the first summer that she went to Santa Fe, 1929. And she did a series of these pictures over 1929 and 30 of this church. But you can see how she has made the physicality of that church part of the landscape itself. So it seems to have a kind of inner sculptural quality that's not man-made. It seems to be part of the natural world. She was very astute in how she kind of did each of these paintings. I think there are 6 of them, if memory serves me correctly. If you've been to the A. McCarter in Fort Worth, you've seen another one from this series. And when we had the show at the A. McCarter a couple of years ago, we brought the 2 paintings together. It was totally fascinating to see them because the palette on this one is so kind of cool, cold. And that one is so much warmer. And the church has a sense of almost breathing in that one, where here is this kind of cool geometric form that's like part of the landscape. But she's also borrowing ideas from colleagues in the Stieglitz Circle that have to do with photography, cropping, close-ups. Paul Strand was somebody who was part of this circle. And so you see this. This is essentially this dark red leaves. Large dark red leaves is essentially a still life, but a new kind of still life, this kind of close-up view. Anybody have any questions? I have to move you on.
Can you talk just for a minute about Stieglitz and who Stieglitz was?
Oh, sure.
Just to give some context.
Alfred Stieglitz, initially a photographer at the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. Very kind of romantic in his images of New York. Was very involved in a series of like a magazine that was coming out called Camera Works that focused on photography in the first 15 years of the 20th century. But he also became a gallerist in New York, opening up a gallery before 1910 that focused on European modernism and American artists. that included John Marin. And then ultimately, he was introduced to O'Keeffe's work through a common friend in the mid-1910s. And so he brought around him a group of very committed artists, both visual artists like Dove, Marin, and O'Keeffe, but also photographer like Paul Strand. And at the end of World War I, they, under Stieglitz's push, really made this break with European modernist stylistic language and decided that they really needed to find something that was American without, as they called it, that kind of French overtone. And so this is the search for a true American landscape painting that would be fresh and new in the 20th century.
Was the flower done in Santa Fe, or was it done in New York?
This painting is done in the Adirondacks in Lake George, New York. This is done in Santa Fe.
So that's part of her Lake George series or composite.
Stieglitz, whom she married, his family had property at Lake George in the Adirondacks, and so every summer they would go and leave New York and go up to Lake George. And so it's very interesting. You know, I'm sure all of you, I know I do myself, have a particular response to certain landscapes that's more visceral than others. Some places you feel more comfortable than you do other places. And in truth, O'Keeffe did not feel completely comfortable in Lake George. There was something, I think, about that northeastern landscape. Maybe it was also because she had such a kind of difficult relationship with Stieglitz's family. But New Mexico, northern New Mexico, just as Texas, where she had been teaching previously, was a place where she really found herself.
How do you feel the light from the New Mexico to upstate New York? Do you feel the light affected the way the pictures came out?
Oh, I don't think there's any question that she was very sensitive to the kind of light in that landscape.
So the
Absolutely.
environmental light of upstate New York versus the Southwest?
Right, I think so. I don't think there's any question. If you've ever spent time in both places, you would really kind of see that we're talking about two very different kind of geographies. The light is a very different kind of experience. And so some of the light that you see in these Lake George landscapes and close-up views of leaves and other parts of the landscape that she was doing have that kind of fall foliage that, you know, is so kind of associated with the Northeast. We have a painting in our collection that is this kind of expressive view of the setting sun, where it's like going down on a hillside and it's just like vibrating out in these kind of incredible colors. And I think that she responded to it, but there was this sense of the kind of open landscape of northern New Mexico that spoke to her, and that kind of crystalline light that you do not have in the Adirondacks. That really was something very special to her. In the same way that if you know, Western Texas, where she had been teaching before she went to New York, was with Stieglitz, she also did some incredibly adventurous, abstract works when she was there. And I think there was a kind of liberation of being also away from New York. I mean, New York, the art world. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, let's move to the city.
Just as a point of history for this institution, the 5th show we ever did in 1964 was a Stieglitz Circle exhibition.
Am I blocking you?
So this is the world of the city. We've left, you know, this world of the American landscape and the way American artists between the wars were other side of the American experience. And Duncan Phillips was very open to a kind of breadth of understanding of what the American experience was about. And so I think this room captures so much of that, because what you see, this is a thematic idea that I've called modern life. And you can see that it's all figurative, but it really adds a kind of psychological aspect of what it is about modern life. It's pretty melancholy, almost grim. This John Sloan painting that you see on the end of the wall, I'll just mention this is a 1910 painting, and Sloan's work was not being acquired by museums. You know, the American Impressionists were very popular in 1910. And if you were a collector or a museum, and you're looking at a Child Hassan painting, or you're looking at this painting, you know, people respond to the Child Hassan painting and not to this. This is like, so it's tougher. And so this is, you know, Sloan looking at a theatrical performer putting on their makeup. And you see the kind of person behind this disguise. And this is a work that Sloan hired a model to come in and wear, you know, put on the costume and paint it. And there's another wonderful Sloan picture on the end of this wall of the city, the train that you see on the right side of this wall, a 1912 painting. And, you know, this is the city in its kind of energy, masculine, vibrant, you know, kind of gritty side that you're looking at. And in that Sloan picture of the elevated train on a winter's night, you know, the surging of the train is emphasized by the diagonal of that track. And then at the very bottom, there's this little line of heads of the people going home at the end of the day. And so you see this kind of connection between how you travel through the city, who it is that's traveling on this public transportation. And it's Duncan Phillips in 1919, 1920, who's responding to John Sloan's kind of gritty pictures, and also to the work of other members of the Robert Henry Circle and others who they called at the time the Ashcan artists. Some of the critics at the time in 1907, 1908 called them apostles of the ugly. You know? This is definitely not the pretty picture of Fifth Avenue that Child Hassan's picture is at all. But you know, that Sloan picture of the clown making up is the first painting by Sloan that went into a museum collection. You know, Phillips bought that in 1919, intending it for the museum. It's really, today we celebrate, Sloan is such a kind of master of early American art in the 20th century that it's hard to realize, you know, that in the first 2 decades, these early pictures of his were so not valued at all. But, you know, this is the real master icon on this wall, this painting by Hopper called Sunday from 1926. And this is, you know, a picture that Duncan Phillips saw in the early months of 1926, at the same time that he's discovering O'Keeffe and Dove. So I just want to point it out that, you know, we're talking a guy who is collecting, who has this kind of excitement about discovering what's happening in the galleries in New York and what American artists are doing. And he's open to many ways of interpreting the American experience. But he buys this painting by Hopper almost as soon as he sees it in the gallery. And he pays what is then the highest price paid for a Hopper oil, $600. And it is only the second oil by Hopper into a museum, because Hopper's reputation around 1920 and the early 20s was really based upon both his prints and especially his watercolors. It was really only in the mid-20s that museums started to pay some attention to his oils. But you see in this picture, Phillips talked about the kind of tension between this beautiful composition that you see of the buildings, these empty buildings in the background, and this, the loneliness, the melancholy of this single figure on the boardwalk, the wooden sidewalk that you see here. This is Hoboken, New Jersey. This is before the Depression officially set in, but you can see that Hopper is speaking to a part of the American experience that is questioning what is the modern experience today. What is our experience in the cities? This kind of loneliness, the isolation. It's really an exceptional painting in terms of kind of teasing out so many of these ideas.
Do you know if Hopper grew up on a farm or did he grow up in the city?
Hopper?
Yeah.
He studied, I'm not going to say that I remember right off the top of my head where he grew up, but he studied in the city with Robert Henry. He's a Robert Henry student, just as Rockwell Kent is in this gallery here, just as Guy Pendabois, this artist here, was. And Sloane, of course, was an associate of Henry. So this idea of the city as subject matter, the life around you as subject matter, was something that Hopper was very much introduced to when he studied with Henry. But he's tougher than Henry. He's edgier than Henry in the way he's making commentary about the modern experience in an urban environment. And if you look at this wall here, this is so wonderful, the way this wall speaks to, John Sloane's thinking about the city and the kind of vibrancy of, many parts of the community of people who live and work in the city and take public transportation here in this 1912 painting. And then on the far end is this 1946 picture by Hopper again, called Approaching the City. And so here the city is so empty, it's forbidding, it's like I'm on a journey. The expectation of what that will be is like fraught with questions. And in between are two works by American artists who were also active in the 20s, responding to the city in a very different way. Hopper generally or often includes one or two figures in his compositions, but the artists that we've called today the Precisionists were then called the Neo-Cubists, and they eliminated figures altogether from their pictures. So this little painting here by Charles Sheeler, called Skyscrapers, from 1922. Phillips purchased this in 1926, the same year he bought the Hopper, Sunday, the same year he's buying Arthur Dove and Georgia O'Keeffe. He's buying Sheeler, and the year before he's buying Stefan Hirsch, who is also part of this idea of seeing the city as geometry, seeing the city as an abstract form, apart from anything that has to do with man moving along in the streets of the city or even suggesting much of that. This is Sheeler's picture is very much inspired by a photograph of New York office buildings that he did that was the inspiration for this. And this kind of frontal lighting, the flattening of the image. These are all things that we associate with Sheeler, and Phillips responded to this, and this is the first oil by Sheeler into a museum. And Hirsch, who was born in Germany to American expat parents, and came to America in 1919 as a young man, New York City is like this kind of armada. It's like such a kind of different view of, the kind of eliminating, the emotional, the figurative, the human element from the city altogether. But Phillips was interested in this kind of conversation about what is American life about. And then he's also interested in artists who are minority artists, artists of color, immigrants, and what their experience in the American, environment is like. And so there's a section that starts in this room on this wall and it goes into this gallery here. It's called Memory and Identity. And Duncan Phillips was interested in artists. This is Carolyn Rowan White, painting from 1935, called Parade on Cannon Street. Cricht is a very sophisticated artist who has a number of different ethnic backgrounds. He lived in an African-American neighborhood in Boston, and this is a Sunday parade that he actually saw. But these, Cricht, Jacob Lawrence, and Horace Pippin, these artists are storytellers. They're telling narrative stories in their paintings about their personal experience in the American society. And Duncan Phillips was very open to the stories that they were telling and felt that they needed to be part of what we understood to be about in the life around us. And it's important to remember that in the 1930s, there was such an emphasis among the critics, who were very conservative, that American scene painting was what they were looking for, and it was supposed to be more uplifting, more affirmative about the American experience. It shouldn't kind of focus on these kind of communities that might be, more peripheral, artists who have, who are not really, at the table. But one of the things that's also so interesting, I think, for us to look at today is that the artists who emigrated to this country in the early part of the 20th century were not always valued by their contemporaries or by critics. They weren't thought to be kind of American in the kind of full sense of the word. But Duncan Phillips really felt that they brought something special to the table, and we'll see that at the end of the row here with Kuniyoshi. Japanese-born American artist. And Kuniyoshi, he came to America when he was about, I don't know, maybe 20? Maybe not that. Maybe 20. The end of his teens. And he lived in the United States from about 1910 until his death in 1953. He was never allowed to naturalize as an American citizen because he was Asian. And even when he married an American woman around 1920, she lost her citizenship because she married. So you see, this kind of prejudice against immigrants from certain parts of the world that came to this country was part of the American art establishment and part of the laws of this country. And so Kuniyoshi, though, is someone who, he was so much a kind of bringing his Japanese sensibility and synthesizing it with his experience in America. This is a painting from fairly early in his mature career. This is from the early 1920s. It's called Maine Family. And he spent time in an artist colony in Maine, in Algonquin, that a number of other artists were in. And he was so interested in American folk art, American memory painting. You go to the Metropolitan or other places and you see these kind of pictures of children and that seem kind of stark and looking at you with these big eyes. And, they are memory paintings often of, children or family members who have passed away early. And, you can see how he kind of incorporates aspects of that into this painting here, but he also has a palette that speaks to the kind of red lacquer work, black ebony work that we associate with Japanese art. But it's such a kind of wonderful synthesis. And Kuniyoshi is an artist that Duncan Phillips admired in 1928. He didn't actually have an opportunity to buy his work until a few years after that. But Kuniyoshi is such a kind of fascinating character because of what he speaks to with American art, that he achieved so much, and he thought of himself as a truly an American artist, but he brings all these elements together, and it speaks to what Duncan Phillips said about American art and artists, that we synthesize people from all over the world into American culture, and that is what really gives us this kind of unifying strength in our art, is that we bring so many things from so many different aspects of the world together into one place in our art. And that Duncan Phillips really believed that art is a universal language, that we all share it, and that we can speak this language together, and that it can. He was such an idealist about how it could break down barriers among cultures and communities. Well, let's go to the last gallery profile.
Do this in 5 minutes.
Did he bring some of the Japanese traditions like the kabuki or, like the doll faces that look very reminiscent?
I think the doll faces is something that kind of find their place in some of his work, absolutely. It's kind of really kind of synthesizing these cultures together. He was fascinated by American folk culture, and I think that he kind of synthesized that with things from his own Japanese background. So this is the conclusion of the exhibition. This is like the section we call abstract expressionism. This is post-war painting, and it brings together such a variety of artists. Richard Diebenkorn, Sam Francis, who spent so much time here in California as a painter. Kenneth Noland, you see that little blue painting on next to the doorway. Philip Guston, Helen Frankenthaler, Morris Lewis, and Clifford Still. And for me, this is such a glorious room to see all of this together, because it ties so many things together for the American art collection of the Phillips, and also relationships that artists have with one another. Because Clifford Still, this incredibly powerful early painting by Still from 1950, he was teaching at the California School of Fine Arts up in San Francisco at the time he did this work. And that is the same time that Diebenkorn was there. So the two of them are like talking to each other. And Diebenkorn is definitely admiring this moment in Clifford Still's work. And so it's totally fantastic that, they live together here in this room. Diebenkorn, whom you all know so well, he's such an iconic individual here in California. Duncan Phillips became aware of Diebenkorn in 1958 because Phillips' nephew, Gifford Phillips, was Diebenkorn's first significant patron. Gifford lived in Santa Monica. He was an active collector. He had grown up visiting his uncle in the Phillips collection. He was totally immersed in what the museum was about. And he told his uncle Duncan about this California artist that he thought really was important and belonged in the Phillips collection. And Duncan Phillips followed up. And this is the first picture that Duncan Phillips bought by Richard Diebenkorn. Interior with view of the ocean, a 1957 picture. It is Diebenkorn's Berkeley studio, and it speaks to that tension between realism and abstraction that you see here. You can see the painting on the table here in the foreground, the chairs in the studio. What we didn't know at the time, but of course Diebenkorn that we found out later through the family, is that during World War II, Diebenkorn was stationed at Quantico Marine Base south of Washington, D.C. And every weekend that he could manage, he went into Washington and he went to the Phillips Collection. And he kind of soaked up what he was seeing there on the walls. He soaked up Arthur Dove, he soaked up Bonnard, he soaked up Matisse. And this painting in particular reflects this grand Matisse painting that we have at the Phillips Collection that's been on view since 1940. So it's this kind of marvelous intersection of an artist who came to the Phillips early in his career and, kind of absorbed things from the Phillips Collection, and then, these things kind of came back. He learned, and Duncan Phillips would have been over the moon to learn that that had been the case. Kenneth Nolan is another artist who spent the 1950s living in Washington, just as Morris Louis spent his career living in Washington, D.C. Both of them came to the Phillips regularly, Diebenkorn talked about the Phillips Collection as a sanctuary. Nolan talked about it as like going to church. He would go there on Sundays and he would look at that little Ryder painting of the moonlit cove, and he would look at the doves, and all of these things kind of find their way into his paintings, and so you have these concentric circle pictures that begin at the end of the 50s. And, they are connected in many ways to imagery that he was finding in these artists at the Phillips Collection. And Morris Louis is another artist. He lived in the same section of the city as the Phillips Collection. And, he, of course, came to the Phillips regularly. We know the story about how he was so influenced by Helen Frankenthaler's work, and he saw it in New York in 1953. But we also know that he learned things from looking at Paul Klee at the Phillips Collection. He absorbed all those grand pictures that emphasize color at the Phillips Collection, from the Renoir, Delacroix. It was, a feast for an artist who was like soaking up ideas. And so, it's really a kind of wonderful opportunity to kind of bring together all these different threads from the Phillips Collection and how artists learn from the collection itself, and how we benefit today by having examples of their work to celebrate here in an exhibition like this. So I knew, kind of run to the end of the